And I was all obviously very aware of it because I used to be a fan of horror. I don't like horror fandom. You know what I watched recently? I watched George A. Romero's Resident Evil, the documentary
Oh,
on his unmade Resident Evil film. And the filmmakers in that who helmed the documentary, I looked into this movie many years ago and talked to some people who were in like the general circle of things that were basically present but not involved in the movie as it was starting to
word.
be ushered forward. And I got more intel for like a 5 minute YouTube video than they wound up getting for this 2 hour and 2 hour and change documentary. It was a long documentary. And it's a well made documentary. A lot of these horror documentaries actually are pretty terrible. Like I was watching the Pet Cemetery, and they ran into a cycle of doing not just unmade movies, but then they would do these celebratory documentaries like Pennywise, the story of it, or the Pet Cemetery documentary, or Fright Night. All of these iconic '80s movies, which frankly are not even that good, wind up with 3 hour documentaries that give the cast members of them something to do for the first time in 25, 30 years, which is nice, I guess. But, and I'm not against the idea in theory, but really we had it better when these were designated as DVD special features and not movies themselves. But some of the movies that had come about from that were really bottom of the barrel. The Pet Cemetery one specifically sticks in my mind as
Yeah.
really poor quality, like below YouTube quality documentary filmmaking. And yet it was very popular. And I was hesitant to check out George A. Romero's Resident Evil, but I'm a big fan of Resident Evil.
Yeah.
And I like George A. Romero. And it's a well made documentary. It's decent, but it's not anything special. You're not going to really learn anything new, especially if you had already investigated the Resident Evil
Mm.
movie that he was preparing back in the late 90s.
Well, you made a documentary about it, right? On the
Yeah, yeah,
channel.
short. There
Yeah.
was a after the deconstruction documentaries popped off on YouTube when Andy Muschietti's version of it was coming to theaters. I dug into several drafts of what would have been Cary Fukunaga's version, and
Mm.
I learned a hard lesson about journalism in those weeks when those documentaries became popular on YouTube because I realized, oh, everyone's now stealing my research and they're not crediting me. Nobody else had the details that I dug into and formulated them. And now I listen to podcasts where they're talking about the It movies and they're citing my research without giving me credit for it. But all the same, we do that all the time. We don't even think about it. If we read something on fucking any given website, we're not giving credit to the website. And so I was like, oh, wow, that's what this game really is. You can work your ass
Mm.
off to do this research and put together these documentaries that are going to be like highly stylized and tell people what this version of things would have been. And then they can just take that and it
Yeah.
exists and it's not yours. And it was never really mine, but you put the effort into building that, into doing that, and you get a couple $100 of YouTube bucks, or maybe I made like a couple $1,000, frankly, off of those documentaries. Nothing crazy. And then it just is out there and people are free to use it. And
Is
that was another thing too that made me veer away from doing the documentary work on the platform because what is it for? Unless that is really your passion, what's it
hmm
for? I like
Yeah,
filmmaking.
I was about to ask, is that why you stopped making them? Because it's too much effort for the return.
Yeah, that was part of it. I think my fascination with unmade movies also died down rather quickly. Once I dug into that, and then the best movies that could have been made and weren't made have already been covered. You
Hmm.
got Jodorowsky's Dune, Superman Lives. What else do you need? There's a couple of
Lightyear
interesting
one.
David Lynch movies, but there's also not a whole lot of information. So even if you were to pick a movie, that doesn't mean anything about the availability of the information that's out there, or maybe it just wasn't developed enough. And in the case of Resident Evil, the George Romero script, I remember reading that when I was 8 or 9 years old, and I reread it when I was about 20, and I thought to myself, this isn't even well written. This is actually kind of a bad script. this documentary that just came out, they didn't really get any new information. It's stuff all you would be able to find online. So that was unfortunate. It was a bit disappointing because I was looking forward to this documentary, but
More
it
stuff
looks
there.
good. It was strung together well. It's just not really a documentary about his Resident Evil. There's a bit of that, but there's not a whole lot to it.
So what's the documentary about if it's not that?
It's mainly about George Romero. There's a lot
Okay.
on, there's like 30, 40 minutes on George Romero at the beginning and then at the end when he was dying. And then you have a slice of, it's like, it's not even a Resident Evil documentary. It's more George Romero. It's like, okay.
Because I downloaded it from YTS because I saw that, but then I was curious as to what it was. Because I'm not like I like Romero a lot. Like I was one of the first horror directors that I followed as a young 20 something year old, but not really a huge fan of the Resident Evil series. Like I never played it that
Mm-hmm.
much, but I was curious as to what that was. But I guess I won't be getting that much new information because there's not that much out there from it.
Yeah, I think the history of Resident Evil is something that's kind of fascinating. Not that it's like anything special, but just having grown up with the games, that was my exposure to horror gaming back in the late 90s. I remember my cousin bringing over the PlayStation hard plastic discs and telling me about that and showing me the first Resident Evil game. He had the director's cut. And then I
Mm.
got Resident Evil 3 Nemesis and Resident Evil Survivor and playing those games late at night and trying to put yourself in the headspace of navigating those maps. And it was always a great time. There's a very solid book called Itchy Tasty about the history of Resident Evil that is so informal about where it started, who had the idea for this thing. And the thing you learn about many successful Japanese properties is they're all ripoffs of something else. And so
Mm.
Resident Evil was a ripoff of Sweet Home, which is a very strange haunted house movie that had a video game of its own. Back when I was doing Let's Plays, I had a couple of guests, and there were unreleased episodes, and Justin Wang was a guest for one of those and decided the video game, and it was the Sweet Home video game. And I don't even have a memory of playing the game or watching the movie, but it's very easy to find out there. So, anyway,